I am Captain Julia Core, 28 years old, United States Army Airborne. Last month, I was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and signed a $6 million book and movie deal. I came home, despite our complicated relationship, hoping this would be the moment that changed everything. And it did. My sister Isolde pushed me down the stairs. But the last thing I heard before I lost consciousness wasn't a scream. It was my mother's ice-cold voice saying, "She deserved that." I woke up 3 days later, alone in a hospital bed at Walter Reed, my career shattered and my bank account emptied by my own parents. Before I tell you about the legal war I waged against my own blood, let me know where you're watching from. If you can relate, show some support with a like and hit follow. Because this story is a reminder that family isn't always blood. The air in our McLean, Virginia home was thick with the scent of money and lilies, a combination I always found suffocating. It was a world away from the dust of Afghanistan, from the honest smell of sweat and gunpowder. Here, everything was polished to a high sheen, from the marble floors to the practiced smiles of the guests. I stood in the grand foyer, feeling like a museum piece in my Army service uniform. The deep blue fabric felt like a second skin, a suit of armor I had earned through grit and sacrifice. The medals pinned to my chest were heavy, each one a story, each one a testament to a life my family refused to understand. Still, a stubborn little flame of hope flickered within me. Tonight, I thought, tonight will be different. I approached my father first. Atticus Core, a distinguished art history professor, stood with his back to me, pontificating to a circle of admirers about Renaissance brushwork. I waited. When he finally turned, his eyes barely registered me. "Father," I said, holding out a small, heavy box. "This is for you." He took the velvet case. Inside was a Swiss timepiece, elegant and understated, an heirloom. "Thank you, Julia," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. He didn't look me in the eye. He simply placed the unopened box on a nearby mahogany table and turned back to his conversation. He didn't even wind it. A familiar chill crept down my spine, the kind I'd felt 1,000 times before. I pushed it down and found my mother, Serafina, holding court by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was a vision in a silk gown, her presence as commanding as a general's. I handed her the distinct orange box. She opened it, pulling out the Hermès scarf. Its colors were vibrant, alive. She held it up, not looking at me, but at a friend standing beside her. "The colors are so bold," she remarked, her tone making the word sound like an insult. "Very military." She folded it neatly and placed it in her clutch, a dismissal so swift it was almost invisible. I found my older sister Isolde near the fireplace, nursing a glass of champagne. She called herself an artist, though her canvases were mostly angry splashes of color that no one but our parents praised. I offered her the gift I'd been most excited about, a professional set of oil paints from a small shop in Paris. Isolde glanced at the beautifully crafted wooden box and sneered, a slight curl of her painted lip. She set it down on the mantelpiece without opening it. "Thanks for thinking of the arts, Julia," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "even if you know nothing about them." The chill in my spine was now a block of ice. I forced a tight smile. "They just need time," I told myself, a desperate, fading mantra. "They just need to understand." Later, a senator's wife, a kind woman with genuine warmth in her eyes, cornered me near the appetizers. "Captain Core," she said, "we are all so proud of you. That medal, my goodness." "And I heard a rumor about a book deal?" The room seemed to quieten around us. I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. "Yes, ma'am," I mumbled, feeling suddenly awkward. "A book and a movie deal." "How wonderful." "For how much, if you don't mind me asking?" I hesitated, then whispered the number. 6 million. A collective sharp intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the room. I looked over at my parents. They weren't beaming with pride. They looked horrified, ashamed, as if I had just announced I was a professional gambler. My father stared into his drink. My mother's face was a mask of cold fury. Then came the sound that shattered everything. A laugh. High-pitched, sharp, and utterly contemptuous. It was Isolde, standing by the fireplace, her body shaking with malicious glee. $6 million, she shrieked, making sure every guest in the sprawling living room could hear. For your little war stories? My God, Hollywood really is scraping the bottom of the barrel. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the echo of her laugh. I stood there, feeling stripped bare, every eye in the room a hostile blade pointed directly at my heart. Isolde began to walk toward me, her movements slow and predatory. She raised her champagne flute. For a moment, I thought she was going to offer a toast, a cruel, sarcastic gesture. I was wrong. With a flick of her wrist, she flung the entire contents of the glass at my chest. The sting of cold champagne hit me like a slap. I watched, paralyzed, as the golden liquid dripped down the front of my uniform, staining the fabric and running over the polished surface of my medals. My medals. "This is for show-offs," she snarled, her face twisted with a jealousy so potent it was terrifying. "Who do you think you are? Do you think you're better than me with your blood money? You will always be the daughter that embarrasses this family." I looked past her, pleading with my eyes for my parents to intervene, to say something, anything. They stood frozen. My father, the great intellectual, turned his back and pretended to study a painting on the wall. My mother, Serafina, simply watched, her expression one of cold, clinical distaste, as if watching a distasteful play. I saw her lean toward my father and whisper, just loud enough for me to hear over the ringing in my ears, "I told you so, Atticus." My heart didn't just break. It disintegrated. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fight for. My only instinct was to flee. I turned, my body numb, and walked toward the grand staircase that led to the front door, to escape. I never made it. "Where do you think you're going, you little gutter rat?" Isolde screamed from behind me. I was at the top of the landing, my hand just reaching for the polished oak banister, when I felt the impact. It wasn't a stumble. It was a deliberate, two-handed shove, delivered with the full force of her body into the middle of my back. My world tilted. Time seemed to slow down and stretch out. There was the feeling of weightlessness, a terrifying second of free fall before my body connected with the first marble step. The impact was a sickening crack that shot through my spine. I tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and broken pride, my head hitting the edge of a step with a final, brutal thud. I came to rest at the bottom, sprawled on the cold, unforgiving floor. A warm wetness began to spread from the back of my head. The shocked gasps of the guests sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. The world was going gray at the edges. Through the encroaching darkness, one sound cut through the haze. It wasn't a scream for help. It wasn't the sound of someone dialing 911. It was my mother's voice, clear, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion, spoken to my father but intended for the entire world to hear. She deserved that, Atticus. Perhaps now she'll learn her place. In the darkness, I didn't think about the pain. I only thought of one question. Why? The darkness that swallowed me on the marble floor wasn't new. As I slipped away, the image of my own blood pooling beneath me dissolved, shifting into a memory from long ago. I was 7, pumping my legs on the swing set in our sprawling backyard, trying to go higher than the oak trees. I went too high. The world flipped, and I landed hard on the manicured lawn. The wind knocked out of me in a silent gasp. I lay there, dazed, my knees scraped and bleeding, looking at the grand windows of our house. I could see them inside. My father reading the New York Times, my mother arranging flowers, Isolde sketching in her notepad. None of them moved. None of them came out. I was invisible then, just as I was now. The pattern of my life was drawn in that moment, a map of indifference I was forced to navigate alone. That fall from the swing was just the first of many. The real one, the one that set the course for everything, came 10 years later. I was 17. And I had made a decision. I found my parents in the study, a room that always smelled of old leather and my father's disapproval. I stood before them, my back straight, my voice steady. and announced that I had been accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And I was going. My father, Atticus, slowly lowered his newspaper. He didn't look at me. He looked at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. "The Core family does not raise followers, Julia," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "We create leaders. You are throwing your life away." It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. My mother, Serafina, let out a long, weary sigh, the kind she reserved for social embarrassments. She turned to my father, speaking as if I wasn't even there. "What will I tell people at the garden parties, Atticus?" Her concern wasn't for my safety or my future, but for her own social standing. My life was just an inconvenient footnote in her carefully curated narrative. 3 weeks later, when Isolde received her acceptance letter to a small, obscure art college in Vermont, my parents uncorked a bottle of vintage champagne. The house filled with laughter and toasts to our brilliant artist. My acceptance to West Point had been met with a funeral silence. Hers was a celebration. That contrast was the first deep cut, the one that never truly healed. It taught me a fundamental truth. In my family's world, my achievements would always be weighed on their scale and would always be found wanting. This system of injustice was perfected at our holiday dinners. Thanksgiving was an annual ritual of psychological torture. Isolde would unveil her latest painting, usually a chaotic, meaningless mess of color, and my parents would lavish praise on her vision and raw talent. They would speak of her future exhibitions in Soho, as if they were a foregone conclusion. Then, all eyes would turn to me. I would try to share my world. I'd talk about earning a promotion, about completing a grueling training course, about the profound sense of purpose I felt leading my soldiers. My father would invariably cut me off, holding up a hand. "All right, Julia, that's enough. Let's not have violent stories at the dinner table." My mother would seize the opportunity to change the subject entirely. "Who's ready for dessert? I was thinking about the Christmas decorations this year." And just like that, my reality, my accomplishments, my entire life would be erased, wiped clean from the conversation as if it were a dirty word. The worst was the summer Isolde was sent on a cultural tour of Florence, Italy, to absorb the masters, as my father put it. I, on the other hand, was sent to a brutal outdoor survival camp in the mountains of North Carolina. The reason given? To build character. One of us was nurtured, the other was to be hardened. One was an investment, the other, a problem to be fixed. Years later, that feeling of being an inconvenient problem reached its peak. I was on a forward operating base in Afghanistan. We had just survived a firefight that had lasted for hours, the air still tasting of metal and fear. My hands were still shaking. I needed to hear a familiar voice, a tether to a world where people didn't try to kill you. I used my satellite phone to call home. My mother answered, her voice distant and impatient. "Julia, is everything all right? I'm in the middle of planning a charity gala." "I'm fine, Mom," I lied. "I just needed to call." "Well, can you call back later? It's a bit hectic here. Is everything normal over there?" Normal. That was the word she used. Normal to describe a place where death was a constant, silent partner. The line was clear. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. I sat in my tent, the canvas walls doing little to block out the sounds of the base. I hugged my rifle to my chest, the cold steel a comfort my own family had never offered, and I cried without making a sound. That was the day I truly understood I was on my own. If you've ever felt like you were speaking a different language from your own family, a language of passion and purpose they refuse to understand, please support my story with a like. And if you feel like you're a fighter in your own life, tell me in the comments. Just write one word: warrior. I want to see how many of us are out there. But even in that vast darkness of my past, there was one pinpoint of light, a memory that saved me. It was my first week of basic training. I was exhausted, covered in mud, my body screaming in protest. I was ready to quit, ready to prove my father right. Command Sergeant Major Evelyn Reed, a woman who seemed carved from granite and sheer will, stood in front of me. She wasn't yelling like the other drill sergeants. She just looked at me, her eyes seeing right through my privileged upbringing and into the terrified core of me. "I see something in you that they don't, Kaur," she said, her voice low and raspy. "They see a rebellious daughter. I see a warrior. Now get up and prove me right." It was the first time anyone had ever seen me. Not the disappointment, not the odd one out, but the person I was fighting to become. That moment, that one person's belief, became my North Star. She gave me a new map, one that didn't lead back to the cold house in McLean, but forward, into the fire. My return to the world was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent pull from a deep, dark ocean into a reality of sharp edges and relentless noise. A steady, rhythmic beeping drilled into my consciousness first, then a sharp chemical smell that stung my nostrils, antiseptic and sterile. And finally, the pain. It wasn't one single pain, but a symphony of it. A searing fire screamed up my spine, a dull, throbbing hammer pounded against the inside of my skull, and a tight, crushing weight squeezed my chest with every breath. I tried to move, but my body was a leaden prison. I was tangled in a web of tubes and wires, tethered to the machines that beeped and hummed around me. My eyes fluttered open. The ceiling was a stark, unforgiving white. The walls were the same sterile shade. This wasn't my room. It wasn't even a civilian hospital. I knew this place from the quiet efficiency, the sense of solemn purpose in the air. This was Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. A man in uniform came into focus, his face kind but etched with professional concern. The eagle insignia on his collar identified him as a colonel. "Captain Kaur," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Colonel Miller. Welcome back. You've been with us for 3 days." I tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He held a cup with a straw to my lips, and the cool water was the most wonderful thing I had ever tasted. He pulled up a stool and began to explain my injuries in a calm, measured tone that couldn't soften the brutality of the words. Traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, and the worst of it, cervical spine damage. He spoke of vertebrae and nerve compression, words that sounded clinical and distant until he delivered the final blow. "The damage to your spine is significant, Captain," he said, his eyes full of a regret I knew was genuine. "You're a fighter, and we expect you'll make a strong recovery. But a career in the airborne, that's no longer possible." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm sorry, Julia. You're going to be medically discharged. Medically discharged." The phrase echoed in the silent room. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a death sentence. Everything I had worked for, everything I had bled for, the very core of my identity, was gone. Stripped away not by enemy fire on a foreign battlefield, but on a marble staircase in my own home. I turned my head and stared at the white ceiling, feeling a profound emptiness, a hollowness deeper and more terrifying than anything I had ever faced in combat. The enemy you can see is never as frightening as the void within. The door burst open, and for a second my broken heart dared to hope. But it wasn't them. It was Liam, my Liam, his face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. Behind him was Command Sergeant Major Evelyn Reed. The sight of me, broken and tethered to machines, shattered her iron composure. This woman, who had faced down insurgents without flinching, had tears streaming down her face. That, more than anything, told me how bad it was. A young nurse, a specialist by her rank, followed them in. She looked nervous, glancing from Liam to me. "Sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper, Your family was here, on the first day." Liam's jaw tightened. "And, did they see her?" The nurse shook her head, unable to meet my eyes. "No, sir. They didn't come into the room. They told the front desk that Captain Kaur had authorized them to collect her personal effects from her locker. They took her purse, her phone, her keys, and then they left." The beeping of the heart monitor beside me quickened its pace. The words hit me with a physical force, a blow more painful than the fall itself. They hadn't come to see if I was alive or dead. They hadn't come to comfort or to repent. They had come to rob me while I lay unconscious, my life hanging in the balance. They came to finish the job. Liam, ever the lawyer, didn't miss a beat. His grief morphed instantly into cold, professional anger. He pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I need to check something," he muttered, his voice dangerously low. He logged into my online banking portal, his face growing darker with every click. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "They didn't." He turned the laptop screen toward me. My savings account, which had held the beginnings of a down payment for a small house, was empty. My checking account, containing the first substantial advance from my book deal, was nearly drained. He showed me the transaction history. A single transfer, made the day after I was admitted. Nearly $80,000 moved into an account under the name of Isolde Carr. It was a calculated, methodical assassination of my life. A plan executed with chilling precision. Liam kept digging. He found an email from my insurance company confirming a request to cancel my long-term disability policy. The request had been made by phone by someone claiming to be me 2 days ago. This wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't a crime of passion. This was a premeditated execution, a systematic dismantling of my past, my present, and my future. All while I was lying in a coma. They weren't just content to see me fall. They wanted to make sure I could never get up again. Tears finally spilled from my eyes, hot and silent. But they were not tears of weakness or despair. They were tears of rage. A cold, hard fury was being forged in the ruins of my heart. I looked at Liam, my everything, who was staring at the screen as if he wanted to punch it. "They took everything," I whispered, my voice raw. He slammed the laptop shut and rushed to my side, grabbing my hand. His grip was an anchor in the storm. "No, Jules, not everything," he said, his voice shaking with a controlled rage of his own. "They don't have me. They don't have Evelyn. They don't have the truth. And I swear to God, I will make them pay back every single cent. I will make them pay for every broken bone, for every tear, for every second you've had to lie in this bed." I took a breath, a ragged, painful thing that felt like swallowing glass. The physical agony was immense, but it was nothing compared to the agony of betrayal. But in that moment, something shifted. The victim inside me died, and the soldier took command. I squeezed his hand back, mustering all the strength I had left. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice weak, but my will unbreakable. "Sue them, Liam," I commanded. "Sue them all." My command to sue them all was the first shot fired in a war I didn't know how to fight, but I wasn't alone in the foxhole. In the quiet, sterile hours that followed, my hospital room at Walter Reed transformed. It ceased to be a place of sickness and loss and became a command post, a sanctuary, a home. It became the one thing the sprawling mansion in McLean, Virginia, never was: safe. The nights were the hardest. The pain was a relentless tide, and sleep offered little escape, its waters filled with the recurring nightmare of falling, the sickening crunch, the cold, dismissive voice of my mother. More than once, I woke up with a strangled scream caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my broken ribs. And every single time, Liam was there. He would be asleep in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, but my smallest whimper would have him awake in an instant. He wouldn't offer empty platitudes. He would simply take my hand or gently push the damp hair from my forehead and whisper, "You're safe, Jules. I'm right here. You're safe," until the frantic rhythm of my heart slowed to match his steady presence. The safety he offered was more real and more profound than any high-tech security system my parents' money could buy. He never came empty-handed. He'd bring me books, reading aloud from John Grisham novels when the pain made the words on the page swim before my eyes. He brought me food from a small greasy spoon diner near Fort Belvoir that the soldiers loved. One evening, he walked in carrying a steaming styrofoam container of macaroni and cheese. It was gooey, bright orange, and probably had no real nutritional value whatsoever. My mother would have called it pedestrian. To me, it was the most beautiful meal I had ever seen. It was comfort. It was care. It was a simple, unconditional act of love that I had craved my entire life. If Liam was the heart of my new family, Command Sergeant Major Evelyn Reed was its steel spine. She arrived every day after duty, her uniform still crisp, bringing with her an aura of disciplined compassion. She never treated me like a patient. She treated me like one of her soldiers. "They broke your body, Car," she said on her first visit, her eyes scanning my IV lines and monitors with tactical appraisal. "But you will not let them break your spirit. That's an order." She became my unofficial physical therapist, showing up in her PT gear on Saturday mornings to supplement the hospital's sessions. She pushed me past the limits I thought the pain had set for me, her voice a firm, steady metronome cutting through my tears of frustration. "Pain is a signal, Captain," she'd say, helping me back to my feet after a failed attempt to stand. "It's not a stop sign." One afternoon, she brought me a tablet. It was loaded with audiobooks and podcasts. "Brené Brown," she said, tapping the screen. "She talks about courage, vulnerability, and daring to enter the arena. This war you're in now, 90% of it is in here," she said, tapping her own temple. "Arm yourself." I started listening that night, and for the first time, I felt like I was gaining a strategic advantage over the invisible enemy of despair. While Sergeant Major Reed fortified my spirit, Liam built the legal war machine around me. He turned a corner of the room into a makeshift law office, a chaotic landscape of legal pads, binders, and his laptop, which was perpetually open. He was relentless, a JAG officer on a personal mission. He spent hours on the phone with bank fraud departments, insurance investigators, and a private detective he'd hired. But he never made a decision without me. He would lay out the options, explain the legal jargon in plain English, and then look at me. "What are your orders, Captain?" he'd ask. It was a deliberate choice of words. He knew what had been taken from me. By making me the commander of the operation, he was giving me back my power, my agency, my rank. "You are not the victim in this story, Jules," he told me, his eyes blazing with conviction. "You're my client. You're the commander of this campaign. I'm just your boots on the ground." For the first time since waking up in this hospital, I felt a flicker of my old self return. The soldier, the leader. The clearest picture of my two families, the one I was born into and the one being forged around my hospital bed, came a week into my stay. A floral arrangement was delivered to my room. It was a large, ostentatious bouquet of white lilies. There was no card, no note, just the funereal scent of the flowers filling the small space. In American culture, you send white lilies to a grieving family to express sympathy for their loss. It was a message, cold, cruel, and clear. As far as they were concerned, I was already dead. I stared at the flowers, a cold dread washing over me. Sergeant Major Reed, who had been quietly reading in the chair, stood up. She didn't say a word. She walked over to the bouquet, lifted the heavy glass vase, and carried it out into the hallway. A moment later, I heard the loud clatter of glass and flowers hitting the bottom of a large metal trash can. She walked back into the room, wiping her hands as if disposing of something unclean. "Trash," she said, her voice flat and final, "belongs in the trash." In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that my real family was right here, in this room. They didn't share my blood, but they shared my foxhole. They were the ones standing guard. That evening, Liam laid out the evidence he had gathered so far. The paper trail was clear. The bank statements, the fraudulent insurance cancellation, the testimony from the nurse. It was all there. "It's strong, Jules," he said, tapping a stack of papers. "But they have expensive lawyers. They'll try to paint you as unstable, claim Isolde was just helping you manage your finances. They'll try to muddy the water." He looked at me, his expression turning serious. "Bank statements and insurance fraud are damning, but they can argue their way around it, create reasonable doubt. We need something they can't deny, something that puts them at the scene with intent. We need a smoking gun." The first move from the enemy camp came 2 days after the funeral flowers. Liam came back from grabbing coffee, his jaw tight with a familiar anger. He told me they had cornered him in the hospital parking garage. Not Isolde, but my father, Atticus Core. For the first time in his life, the esteemed professor had deigned to plead. He didn't ask how you were, Liam recounted, his voice laced with disgust as he paced the small room. He didn't express an ounce of remorse. He just wanted to handle this quietly. Those were his words. Liam stopped and looked at me. He said you were being emotional and that if you dropped the lawsuit, they'd return the money. His main concern? The family's reputation. That a public scandal would be ruinous. I felt nothing. No shock, no fresh wave of pain. Just a cold, weary confirmation of a truth I had known my entire life. To my father, I was not a daughter who had been nearly killed. I was a public relations crisis to be managed. His love, his concern, it was all conditional, tethered to the image of perfection he curated for the world. In the Army, we have a creed: never leave a fallen comrade. My family's creed, I realized, was never allow a fallen comrade to tarnish the family name. The real ambush came a few days later. It was the first time I'd been allowed outside. A young, cheerful nurse was pushing my wheelchair through a small manicured garden near the hospital's main entrance, and the crisp autumn air felt revelatory on my skin. For a few precious moments, I closed my eyes and just breathed, feeling a sliver of hope. And then I saw them, standing near the exit as if they had been waiting, my mother and Isolde. My mother, Serafina, was the picture of East Coast elegance, dressed in a classic, cream-colored Chanel tweed suit, her hair perfectly coiffed. She looked as if she'd just come from a board meeting for the local art museum, not a confrontation with her hospitalized daughter. The sheer, breathtaking inappropriateness of her attire was a statement in itself. She was above this. This was all beneath her. Isolde stood beside her, arms crossed, a familiar, defiant smirk playing on her lips. There was no remorse in their eyes, only annoyance. My nurse, sensing the tension, instinctively slowed the wheelchair. "That's far enough, thank you," my mother said to the nurse, dismissing her as if she were a waitress. The nurse looked at me, uncertain, and I gave her a slight nod. She retreated to a respectful distance. Serafina glided towards me, her expensive perfume cutting through the clean hospital air. "Julia, you will stop this charade at once," she began, her voice low but carrying the weight of a command. "You are embarrassing the entire family. People are talking. You always did love the attention. But this is simply too much." Charade. The word hung in the air between us, as if my broken ribs, my fractured skull, my stolen career were all just a performance I was putting on for sympathy. Isolde stepped forward, her smirk widening into a sneer. The venom in her voice was thick enough to taste. "You just fell. Get over it. Why do you always have to be so dramatic, always playing the victim?" She took another step, leaning down slightly, her face close to mine. "Frankly, you should thank me. I did you a favor. I helped you see that pathetic little army world was never for you anyway." I looked up from my wheelchair, past my mother's perfectly tailored suit, and met my sister's gaze. And for the first time in my life, her words didn't find their target. They didn't pierce my heart. I felt no sting of betrayal, no familiar ache of inadequacy. All I saw was a hollow, pathetic creature consumed by an envy so deep it had rotted her from the inside out. I felt a flicker of something I never expected to feel for her: pity. So I said nothing. I just held her gaze, my silence a shield she had never encountered before. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply watched them, and in my silence, their power evaporated. It was the most powerful weapon I had ever deployed. My lack of a reaction infuriated them. It was Serafina who broke first. Her mask of detached superiority cracked, revealing the raw panic beneath. She stepped forward, her face contorted in a snarl, and crouched down so she was at my eye level. Her voice dropped to a venomous hiss, meant only for me. "Listen to me, you little bitch," she whispered, the Chanel-clad paragon of high society vanishing completely. "You will drop this lawsuit. If you don't, you will have nothing. We will tell the court you have severe PTSD from your time in Afghanistan, that you're mentally unstable, that you hurt yourself for attention." Her eyes were cold, dead things. "Who do you think they'll believe, Julia? A decorated war hero's grieving family? or the unstable soldier who imagined it all? That was it. The final line. The point of no return. They weren't just trying to silence me. They were willing to desecrate the one thing I had left, my honor, my service, to save themselves. They would use the very real trauma of war, a sacred burden carried by so many, as a weapon to destroy me. In that moment, any lingering trace of love I had for these women turned to ash. I think that's enough. The voice was calm, male, and full of authority. We all turned. A man in a simple detective's coat was standing a few feet away. Detective Harding. Liam must have anticipated this. My mother shot to her feet, instantly recomposing herself, the mask of civility snapping back into place. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "This is a private family matter." "Not anymore, it isn't," Harding said evenly, taking a step forward. His presence was an immovable object. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you and your daughter to leave the hospital grounds." Serafina shot me one last look of pure hatred before turning on her heel and stalking away, Isolde trailing behind her like a malevolent shadow. I sat there in my wheelchair, the cold air feeling sharp in my lungs. I had faced them, and I had not broken. I had held the line. Detective Harding walked over to me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something that looked like respect. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was my phone, its screen shattered. He held it out to me. "We recovered everything, Captain," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Are you ready to listen?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Ready to listen?" Detective Harding's question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. This was it. The smoking gun Liam had talked about. The one piece of evidence that could either arm me for the fight of my life or shatter the last fragments of my resolve. I looked at Liam, then at Sergeant Major Reed. Their faces were grim, but their eyes held a steady, unwavering belief in me. I took a shaky breath and nodded. Back in the sterile confines of my hospital room, the three of them, my new family, my war council, gathered around me. Detective Harding carefully removed my shattered phone from its evidence bag and handed it to Liam. "The tech guys said it was a miracle the memory card survived," Harding explained. "There's one audio file, recorded on the night of the incident, about 15 minutes long. It seems a voice memo app was accidentally activated in your jacket pocket." He explained that he had a theory. "I use that app constantly to record notes and ideas for my book. In the chaos of the party, I must have bumped the phone and started it recording without realizing. It wasn't fate. It wasn't divine intervention. It was a soldier's habit, a writer's tool that had inadvertently become a silent witness." The room fell silent. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor, a rhythmic countdown to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I looked over at the small collection of photos taped to the wall beside my bed. Pictures of my unit, of comrades I had lost. I saw the face of Sergeant Miller, who had died in my arms. They had fought for the truth. They had died for it. The least I could do was listen to it. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Play it." Liam connected the phone to a small portable speaker, the kind we'd use to play music on deployment. He hit play. The first sound was the dull roar of the party, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, the distant strain of a classical string quartet. Then, cutting through the noise, was Isolde's voice, sharp and laced with her signature jealousy. $6 million for your little bang-bang stories?" Her mocking laughter filled the speaker, and I flinched, the sound as sharp as a physical blow. Then came my own voice, strained and weary. "I'm tired, Isolde. I'm just going to go." The recording captured the sound of my footsteps, the sharp shriek from my sister. "Where do you think you're going, you little rat?" And then, the sound that would be forever burned into my memory. A sickening sharp crack as my head hit the marble, followed by a series of heavy, brutal thuds as my body tumbled down the stairs. And then, a profound, chilling silence. My own heart seemed to stop in my chest. I closed my eyes, my hands gripping the arms of my wheelchair so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was back there, at the bottom of the stairs, submerged in that terrifying darkness. The silence on the recording stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then it was broken by my father's voice, trembling, but not with fear for me. It was the tremble of a man whose perfect evening had been ruined. "Serafina," he said, his voice a harsh whisper, "call 911. My mother's reply was not the scream of a horrified parent. It was a sound colder and harder than the marble floor my blood was staining. "Wait, Atticus," she hissed. There was a pause, and I could almost feel her standing over me, looking down. "Let me see if it's still breathing." Another beat of silence. It deserved it. A strangled sob escaped Liam's lips. Sergeant Major Reed's hand found my shoulder, her grip like iron, grounding me. My father's voice came again, faster now, laced with a frantic, calculating urgency. "Listen, Isolde is hysterical. We have to control the narrative. I'll handle the guests. You go upstairs and get her purse and her phone from her room. Now, before the police get here, we need access to her accounts." The final sounds on the recording were the soft, hurried footsteps of my mother ascending the grand staircase, not to call for help, but to begin the plunder. Then, the file ended. Liam stabbed the stop button. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, heavier and more complete than anything I had ever known. The steady beeping of my heart monitor was the only proof that I was still alive. Slowly, I opened my eyes. Tears were streaming down my face, but for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow. The part of me that had spent a lifetime loving them, craving their approval, hoping they would one day see me, that part of me died in the silence as that recording ended. The grief was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was the cold, unalterable, and brutal truth. And beneath it, a bedrock of pure, unadulterated rage. I had the proof, not just of their crime, but of their character. It wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a moral one. Liam's face was ashen. Sergeant Major Reed's eyes were blazing with a fire so intense I could feel its heat. I looked from one to the other, my family, my soldiers. Then I looked at Detective Harding, whose professional mask couldn't quite hide the look of disgust on his face. My gaze was no longer that of a victim. It was the gaze of a judge who had just heard the final, damning evidence. If you believe that facing the truth, no matter how ugly, is the only path to real freedom, please support my story with a like. And if you agree that what my family deserves is justice, tell me in the comments. Just write one word: justice. I need to know you're with me on this. I turned my eyes back to Liam, my voice devoid of any warmth, any weakness. It was as cold and hard as the steel in Sergeant Reed's spine. "Release it," I commanded. "I want the whole world to hear." My command, "Release it," hung in the air, transforming the sterile hospital room into a theater of war. The shock from the audio recording had vaporized, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The soldier in me, the one who had been dormant beneath layers of pain and betrayal, was now fully awake. My bed was the command post. Liam was my legal counsel, and Command Sergeant Major Reed was my second in command. The mission, Operation Justice. In the military, before any major operation, you map the terrain. You study the enemy, their strengths, their weaknesses, their patterns. My hospital whiteboard, normally used for tracking medication schedules, became my battle map. With a black marker gripped in my hand, I began to diagram the last 2 decades of my life. It wasn't an exercise in self-pity, it was a strategic analysis. I listed every dismissive comment, every forgotten birthday, every time my achievements were ignored in favor of Isolde's mediocre art. I detailed the trip to Florence they took with Isolde for her 16th birthday, while I was sent to a brutal survivalist summer camp in North Carolina to build character. Each memory was a pin on the map, not a wound to be lamented, but a piece of intelligence. It formed a clear, undeniable pattern. "They will paint me as unstable," I told Liam, my voice steady as I drew a line connecting my father's disdain for West Point to my mother's comments at the party. They'll use their reputation as respected members of the McLean community to discredit me. So, we have to prove that the only instability here is their insatiable greed and pathological jealousy. This wasn't a random act. This was the culmination of a lifelong campaign. My pain had been weaponized against me. Now I was turning my history into ammunition. Liam, armed with this new strategic overview, made a call. "I remember you mentioning a neighbor," he said to me. "An older woman? Mrs. Gable?" I nodded, and he found her number. Mrs. Gable was a sweet, sharp-as-a-tack widow who had lived next door to my family for 30 years. She had always been kind to me, often leaving cookies on our doorstep after I'd spent a weekend weeding her garden beds. She not only remembered everything, she had proof. Her home security system, which she'd installed after her husband passed, had a camera angle that covered our front driveway. She had footage from the night of the party, showing the guests arriving, and more importantly, leaving in a panicked hurry. But her most powerful evidence wasn't on a hard drive. "That child has a heart of gold," she told Liam over the phone, her voice cracking with emotion. I'd watch her, year after year, tending to that big garden all by herself while the rest of them were off in Europe or the Hamptons. They have hearts of stone, that family. Of course, I'll testify. Her words provided a crucial, unimpeachable third-party perspective. She was the character witness I never knew I had. As we built our offense, I knew we had to prepare for their counterattack. My mother's threat to use my service record and the possibility of PTSD against me was not an empty one. In the court of public opinion, they would try to control the narrative. "We have to get ahead of it," I told Liam. "We strike first." Together, we drafted a press release. It was short, professional, and devoid of emotion. It simply stated the facts. Liam sent it out through his law firm's official channels. U.S. Army Captain Julia Carr is recovering from a serious assault and has filed a civil suit against members of her family for battery and financial fraud. The statement landed like a surgical strike. It immediately framed the narrative around facts, assault, fraud, and put my family on the defensive, robbing them of the chance to spin their own web of lies. That same day, I received an unexpected piece of intelligence from an allied force I didn't know I had. An email popped up on the new phone Liam had bought for me. The sender was Alistair Finch, the Hollywood producer behind my book-to-film deal. My heart sank. I was sure it was a letter terminating our contract. Instead, I read, "Dear Captain Core, I was deeply saddened to hear of the recent events. Please accept my sincerest wishes for your swift and complete recovery. I want to make one thing clear. Your story is not over. It has just begun a new chapter. We will be waiting. Your voice is more important now than ever. Sincerely, Alistair Finch." That email was a lifeline. It was a powerful validation from the outside world, a world my family despised, confirming that my story, my life, had value. It was everything they had spent my entire life denying. The legal battle fueled my physical one. Every session of physical therapy became a mission. The parallel bars in the rehab room were my new obstacle course. The pain was excruciating, but I channeled the wisdom of one of the books Sergeant Major Reed had given me, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." I couldn't change what my family had done, but I could change how I responded. I could choose to fight. I could choose to heal. Learning to walk again was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It demanded a level of discipline that made Ranger School look easy. For weeks, every attempt ended in failure, my legs buckling beneath me. But I kept getting back up. Then, one afternoon, with Liam spotting me, I gripped the parallel bars. I pushed through the searing pain in my back and the screaming protest of my muscles. I put one foot in front of the other, one step, then two, then three. My legs gave out on the third step, but Liam was there to catch me, his arms wrapping around me as I collapsed, sobbing. They were not tears of pain, but of triumph. I looked up at him, my eyes blurry, and whispered a new vow, a new promise to myself. I will walk into that courtroom on my own 2 feet. The day I walked into the courtroom, I kept a promise to myself. I left the wheelchair behind. Leaning on a single simple cane, I made my way down the center aisle of the hushed, wood-paneled room. Each step was a small victory, a quiet declaration of war. I was dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, my hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. I was no longer a patient. I was Captain Julia Core, and I was reporting for duty. My eyes were fixed forward on the judge's bench. I did not look at the defense table, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the shock radiating from my mother, Serafina. Liam had told me their lawyers had built their entire defense strategy around the image of me as a broken, unstable victim. They had expected a casualty on a stretcher. They were met with a soldier on her feet. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father, Atticus, slump slightly in his chair. The first crack in their perfect facade had appeared. In the gallery, I spotted two familiar faces. Command Sergeant Major Reed, sitting ramrod straight, her presence a silent, solid pillar of support. A few rows back sat Mr. Alistair Finch, the Hollywood producer, his expression one of intense focus. A handful of reporters were scattered amongst the public. This was no longer just a family drama. It was a public reckoning. When my name was called, I took the stand. As I raised my right hand to be sworn in, I didn't think about my family. I thought about the oath I took as a cadet at West Point, the promise to uphold honor and truth. I was not just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the uniform I had been so proud to wear. Liam began his questioning. My voice was calm, clear, and precise. I recounted the events of that night not as a hysterical victim, but as a military officer delivering an after-action report. I stated the facts, presented the timeline, and described the assault without tears or embellishment. The more clinical I was, the more monstrous their actions seemed in contrast. Then, it was the defense's turn. A slick, expensive-looking lawyer I'd never seen before approached the witness stand, his smile dripping with false sympathy. "Captain Core," he began, "you've served your country with distinction, and we are all grateful. But isn't it true that your service in Afghanistan was traumatic?" I saw the strategy immediately. They were going to follow through on my mother's threat. My service had its challenges. Yes, I replied evenly. Challenges that included firefights, explosions, events that could lead a person to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, he pressed. Isn't it possible, Captain, that in your heightened emotional state, you misinterpreted the events of that evening? That you didn't fall, but perhaps stumbled? I held his gaze. I did not look at Liam. I did not look at the judge. I turned my head slightly and looked directly at the 12 faces in the jury box. I have faced enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the courtroom silence. I know the difference between reality and a hallucination. I know the difference between the fog of war and the crystal-clear memory of my sister's hands shoving me from behind. And I know the difference between a stumble and a push. A murmur went through the gallery. The defense lawyer's smug smile faltered. He had lost control. But the final, fatal blow was yet to come. Liam stood up. The prosecution would like to play for the court a piece of evidence recovered from Captain Core's personal cell phone. An audio file, Your Honor, Exhibit A. The judge nodded. The courtroom air grew thick with anticipation. A clerk connected the speaker system, and a faint static filled the room. Then, the sound of my party, a lifetime ago. I heard Isolde's mocking laugh, my own tired voice, and then the sharp, sickening sequence of cracks and thuds that ended my career. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Then came the silence on the tape, a heavy, dead silence that was more damning than any scream. And into that silence, my father's panicked voice, followed by my mother's, as cold and hard as a tombstone. It deserved it. The courtroom was frozen, no one moved, no one breathed. Then came the rest of the recording, the calculated, frantic plan to cover their tracks, to steal my money, to leave me with nothing. As the final sound of my mother's footsteps faded, Liam hit stop. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the jury. One woman, a grandmotherly type, had her hand clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Another juror, a man who looked like a construction worker, was staring at my family with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I finally allowed myself to look at them. Isolde was weeping, her face buried in her hands. My father, the great intellectual, had his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. And my mother. Her face was the color of chalk. Her carefully constructed mask of superiority had been shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind only the ugly, naked truth of who she was. The game was over. Their lawyer, looking pale and shaken, made a desperate plea for his clients to be released on bail pending trial. The judge, a stern gray-haired woman, looked down from her bench, her face a mask of cold fury. She removed her glasses slowly. "Counselor," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "This court has just heard evidence of a brutal, premeditated assault, followed by a conspiracy to defraud the victim while she lay unconscious." She looked directly at my parents and Isolde. "Based on the clear evidence of violent conduct and a concerted effort to conceal a crime, this court finds the defendants to be a significant flight risk and a danger to the community. Bail is denied." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed the sound of my own fall. The defendants will be remanded into custody. As two bailiffs approached the defense table with handcuffs, my mother's composure finally, completely, and spectacularly shattered. She shot to her feet, her face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief. "Julia!" she shrieked, a wild animal sound of fury and despair. "Julia!" But I didn't turn around. I had heard everything I ever needed to hear. The sound of the gavel was the end of the battle, but it wasn't the end of the war. The victory I'd fought so hard for didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a cathartic release. Instead, as Liam drove me away from the courthouse, all I felt was a profound, crushing emptiness. I had won. But in the process, I had officially lost my family forever. The war was over, and I was left standing alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. The days that followed were a blur of quiet exhaustion. I stayed at Liam's apartment, a cozy, lived-in space that felt more like a home than my childhood house ever had. I'd spend hours just sitting on his couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, staring out the window at the bustling Washington, D.C. streets below. The world was moving on, but I was stuck in the quiet aftermath, processing the shrapnel lodged in my soul. Liam was my rock. He didn't push me to talk. He didn't tell me I should be happy. He just existed alongside me in the silence, bringing me hot tea, making sure I ate, his steady presence a quiet promise that I wasn't truly alone. Then came the messages. My phone, once a source of anxiety, now became a weapon of mass annoyance. Voicemails and texts flooded in from aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't heard from in years. They hadn't called when I was in the hospital. They hadn't called when I was learning to walk again. But now, with their family names splashed across the headlines, they called. The messages were all the same, a manipulative cocktail of feigned concern and veiled guilt-tripping. "She's still your mother, Julia. Think of what this is doing to the family. Can't you find it in your heart to have some mercy for the sake of blood?" I deleted them all without listening to the end. One afternoon, while I was systematically clearing out the barrage of messages, Sergeant Major Reed came to visit. She watched me for a moment, my thumb jabbing at the delete button with grim determination. "They're not calling for you, you know," she said, her voice calm and even. "They're calling for themselves, to ease their own conscience for a lifetime of silence." She sat down opposite me, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Loyalty is earned, Carr. It isn't inherited with a last name." Her words were a splash of cold, clean water, washing away the lingering residue of guilt they were trying to smear on me. She was right. My loyalty belonged to the people who had stood in the foxhole with me, not the ones who had pushed me into it. Amidst the noise of hollow apologies and familial duty, one voice broke through. It wasn't a text or a voicemail, but a thick, cream-colored envelope that arrived in the mail. A handwritten letter. The return address was a small town in Vermont I knew my younger brother, Kalen, had moved to. With trembling hands, I opened it. His handwriting was a familiar, slightly frantic scrawl. The letter wasn't an excuse or a plea. It was a confession. He wrote that he hadn't slept a full night since the party, that my screams on the recording echoed in his head. He admitted that he had spent his whole life terrified of our parents and Isolde, and that his silence that night was the greatest act of cowardice in his life. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. He wrote that he didn't deserve it. He just said that he had started seeing a therapist to understand why he had been so afraid to do the right thing, and that he hoped one day he could become the kind of brother I'd always deserved. Near the end of the letter, he had quoted something he'd heard in a sermon at his local church. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Below it, he had simply written, "I'm so sorry I did nothing." That letter, with its raw honesty and lack of excuses, was the first thing that had truly touched my heart since the trial. A few days later, I went to my first meeting. It was a support group for wounded veterans at Walter Reed. Sitting in a circle with men and women who bore both visible and invisible scars, I didn't have to explain anything. The pain of losing a limb was different from the pain of losing a family. But the language of trauma, of survival, was universal. Listening to their stories, their struggles, and their small victories, I realized two things. My pain was valid, and I was not alone. It gave me the final piece of strength I needed to do what had to be done. That night, with Liam by my side, I sat down and wrote one last letter. It was addressed to Atticus, Serafina, and Isolde Carr, in care of their respective correctional facilities. The letter was short. I have heard the recording. I know what you did, and I know who you are. I am writing this to tell you that I will not carry hatred for you. To hate you would be to let you continue to occupy a space in my life, and that is a privilege you no longer have. I will not seek revenge. I will simply seek peace. You are now a part of my past. I am officially, and finally, letting you go. After Liam mailed it, I felt a weight I didn't even know I was still carrying lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was a release. I was setting my own boundary, building a new frontier for my future. I picked up my phone and dialed a number in Vermont. He answered on the second ring. Hello? Kalen's voice was hesitant, nervous. Kalen, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. It's Julia. I got your letter. A long pause filled the line. Then, quietly, I'm glad. Me too, I said. Maybe we could get coffee next week. 18 months can feel like a lifetime, or in my case, the beginning of a new one. The scene is not a hospital room or a courthouse. It's the Mojave Desert in California, just before dawn. The air is cold and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. A sprawling film set recreating a forward operating base in Afghanistan stands stark against the vast, empty landscape. And in the middle of it all, I walk. Not with a cane, not with a limp, but with a confident, easy stride that feels like a miracle. I'm not in uniform anymore. I'm wearing dusty jeans, a simple t-shirt, and sunglasses perched on my head, my hair tied back in a messy ponytail. I'm laughing, deep in a spirited discussion with the film's director, a man whose work I've admired for years. I am, for the first time in a long time, completely and utterly myself. Liam is here, of course. He's leaning against a director's chair, watching me with a soft smile that still makes my heart ache in the best possible way. A simple, elegant ring sits on my left hand. We're engaged. The future is no longer a question mark. It's a promise. The past has been settled too. The final verdict came down 6 months ago. Isolde was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary for felony assault. My parents, Atticus and Serafina, each received 3 years for conspiracy and grand larceny. Their appeals were swiftly denied. Justice, it turned out, wasn't just a concept in a law book. It was real. It was final. My new family is here too. The one forged in fire. Sergeant Major Reed, now happily retired, drove her RV out to the desert to visit the set for a week. She sits with Liam, a proud maternal smile on her face as she watches a scene being filmed. She's every bit the tough, loving mother I never had. Kalen, my brother, came to visit last month. He's different now, quieter, more thoughtful. The therapy has been good for him. Our relationship is still a delicate, fragile thing, like a desert flower learning to bloom after a long drought. We don't talk about the past. We talk about the future. His plans to teach history, my work on the film. My family now is not defined by a shared last name, but by a shared choice. The choice to show up, to stay, to care. My role on this film set is more than just a military technical advisor. Mr. Finch, true to his word, insisted I be a core part of the creative team. I've become the keeper of the story's soul. One afternoon, I'm working with the young actress playing me. She's a brilliant talent, fierce and dedicated. But she's struggling with a key scene, the moment at the party when Isolde throws the champagne. I just can't find the anger, she says, her brow furrowed in frustration during a break. I feel like I should be screaming at her, fighting back. I guide her to a quiet spot away from the crew. That's because you're looking for the wrong emotion, I tell her gently. When it happened, I wasn't angry. Not at first. I was just surprised. She looks at me, confused. I try to explain the insight that took me years of pain to understand. The deepest wound isn't the hatred from someone you know dislikes you. It's the shock of realizing that the unconditional love you thought was your foundation, the one thing in the world you could count on, never actually existed at all. It was all a story you were telling yourself. I look into her young, earnest eyes. So don't play the anger. Play the stunning, breathtaking surprise of a person realizing they are and always have been, completely and utterly alone in the one place they were supposed to call home. She stares at me for a long moment, and then her eyes fill with a sudden, profound understanding. She nods, a silent thank you, passing between us. In that moment, I realize my scars are no longer just marks of pain. They are maps, and I can use them to help others navigate their own difficult terrain. The tragedy has been transformed into a legacy. The story ends here, where it began. With me, but a different me. A whole me. Liam and I are standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking the desert floor. We've woken up early to watch the sunrise. The sky is a deep, velvety purple, just beginning to bleed into shades of orange and pink at the horizon. The air is still and cold, and I pull my jacket tighter, leaning into his warmth. We stand in comfortable silence, watching the world awaken. The sun finally crests the distant mountains, flooding the harsh landscape with a soft, golden light, chasing away the long shadows. My past feels like that landscape, vast, challenging, and once seemingly impossible to survive. But standing here, in the light of a new day, I see it for what it is. Not a wasteland, but a place of stark, resilient beauty. A place that tested me, broke me, and ultimately revealed the strength I never knew I had. Do you have any regrets? Liam asked softly, his voice barely disturbing the morning's peace. I think about the years of trying to earn an unearnable love. I think about the pain, the betrayal, the fight to reclaim my life from the ashes. I think about the person I was and the person I have become. A slow smile spreads across my face. It's a genuine smile, one that reaches my eyes. I don't regret fighting, I say, my voice clear and steady in the morning air. The fire was meant to burn me to the ground. Instead, it just forged me stronger. Thank you for walking with me through the fire. My story is finished, but I know that for many of you, your own battles continue. Remember, the family you forge in loyalty is just as real as the one you are born into. And our deepest scars often teach the most profound lessons. This channel is a place for all the warriors, the survivors, and the builders of new dawns. If you believe in the power of resilience, please subscribe to join our community. We have so many more stories of justice and hope to share. Until next time, stay strong.